Let's bring the protests into the room.
This is how the Gen Z are transforming the nature of protest in Kenya.
This time around, the Stones are music, poetry, drama, satire, and different forms of playful expressions of resistance. The use of hashtags. The Gen Zs showed the world that hashtags could become a language. And if you follow the hashtags, you follow the flow carefully, unlike how it was previously, where protests would actually be led by a figure. So these political identities you would commonly hear among African Gen Zs would be hashtag partyless, hashtag tribeless, and hashtag leaderless. Partyless in that they argue that parties in Africa have become the vehicles for state capture. Tribeless in the sense that they do not want to be associated with tribe. Leaderless, a leaderless form of mass mobilization on the streets. And this has actually represented a really powerful political capital, as it were, because it has overwhelmed governments. Governments in Africa haven't understood how to grapple with a movement that has no leader. Previously, if you would capture a leader, then you captured the movement.
But sometimes you also speak about the Gen Z movement being the watchdogs of democracy.
The Gen Zs have values: transparency, accountability, environmental friendliness, social consciousness, orientation to family, abhorrence for injustice. Their strength remains in trying to always counter emergent authoritarianism, systemic corruption, abuse of the ballot and all that. And so at the end of the day, what their role becomes in society, especially in democratic space, would be the watchdogs. This is the first time we're seeing a movement being led by teenagers as young as 16, 17, with really high intellectual, political consciousness. They're really tech savvy, quick to adapt to different tools and technologies and all that. So if we come back to how their movement is different from previous movements, I think one analyst from Kenya spoke about them as being the most militant social formation in Africa's history ever since the decades of independence in the 1960s. And in their militancy, they are trying to pursue a systemic overhaul. What do you do when corruption has become systemic, when the ballot doesn't seem to have the power it should, when accountability and transparency aren't as they should be?
The use of humor, satire and memes as part of the communication around the movement. And I suggest that we take a look at this TikTok video from Madagascar.
Skip. But when does this game get fucking good?
This is just an account from Gassi Badi. He's actually just a Malagasy TikToker who goes by that name, but he also creates content. And this is exactly the kind of content, 10 seconds. But these are the kind of videos that represent the stones the Gen Zs actually wield in their protest movements now.
Stones?
Yeah, the stones in terms of the difference between the previous protests where stones, physical stones, were used as weapons for protesting, but this is now a stone.
How does satire drive Gen Z protests into the streets? And why does satire become so powerful?
3 days ago, Yoweri Museveni actually, in a way, slammed the Gen Z movement for vibing. In other words, he was critiquing the Gen Z movement for the fact that all they know is how to vibe on social media, and they vibe to tunes maybe like Amapiano in South Africa, the South Africa tune, but according to him, he argued that the Gen Zs only know how to vibe, and they haven't been able to build anything substantial in the country, comparing to his time when he argues that when he was of the age of the Gen Z in Uganda, they had formed a movement, a rebel movement that was beginning to and would eventually succeed succeed to overthrow the dictatorial regime of Idi Amin in the 1970s. But one of the things that the old guard haven't come to understand is that in vibing, the vibe in itself becomes the tool to overthrow the emergent authoritarianism we're beginning to see now in East Africa. And this is one of the ways to understand satire.
Do you see that the Gen Z movement can lead to these shifts in democratic practices? Or is it more of a moment-driven phenomenon, if we can call it that?
We are dealing with a generational shift, okay? And I remember when I was speaking to the Gen Zs in Kenya, they spoke about how especially some of the Uber drivers, when I move around the street, the Uber drivers speak about how they are seeing a much more vociferous generation, which is in the younger generations coming at the generation Alpha. And now we are actually now giving birth to generation Beta.
Yes.
One of the reasons why I think the Gen Z movement might go beyond just a momentary phenomenon is the fact that their main objective on the continent of Africa is to spread a civic consciousness. I think that's the real power of the movement, that it has the potential to change the kind of politics we see on the continent going forward towards what the African Union has called the 2063, the Africa we want. And so that's why I believe that this is a beginning of a political awakening. We should also start building scenarios as futurists on the kind of politics that could emerge from the beginnings, these seeds of what we are beginning to see now.
So what you're saying is that as a futurist, you expect that we may see even stronger politically engaged youth movements on the African continent. Is that correct?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And to also think about the kind of militancy we might be seeing in a generation, because the generation Alpha have their own values. In the Gen Z movement, we've seen the values they have has been transparency, accountability, environmental friendliness, and all of that. Gen Alpha has their own values, which would likely introduce a new form of overwhelm for governments, and Gen Beta as well. And so having this base of civic consciousness being, established by the Gen Zs, I think is really important to understand how that transcends to other generations and the kind of political climates we could actually begin to see.
So how can African leaders approach now the frustration voiced by Generation Z?
The importance of trust is something I see that the governments in Africa would need to invest in. How to really slowly start deliberately and intentionally building vehicles and agencies that promote trust in itself as a political capital. I think this is something the African leaders would need to start thinking about. And also then finally, one of the other aspects I think that African leaders would need to now slowly start building would be how to, in a way, reform policing. So in Kenya, many people have spoken about how the police force has to now be transformed into the police service. So police force actually comes from a definition of what has been called regime policing, where police actually becomes a vehicle to protect the regime rather than protect the people.
What we have discussed now this afternoon is not only a wave of youth movement and activism, it's a new way of redefining democratic practices, isn't it? You have been talking about civic consciousness, about generational values, about a generational awakening, the hashtag languages. We have learned so much. But what the Gen Z is also signaling is a future of stronger accountability. That's what we see on the horizon, participation, and what governance might look like. The challenge, but also the opportunity for decision makers now is to ensure that these new forms of civic engagement that we're seeing actually strengthen democratic institutions, isn't it? You were talking about the police as one example. And eventually, I mean, more equal societies is the aim and the objective of the Gen Z movement. Please join me in a warm hand of applause for Martins for your excellent contributions.